Chapter 14. Elliot Stryker lived in a large, pleasant, contemporary house overlooking the golf course at the Las Vegas Country Club. The rooms were warm, inviting, decorated in earth tones, with J. Robert Scott furniture complemented by a few antique pieces, and richly textured Edward Fields carpets. He owned a fine collection of paintings by Ivan Earle, Jason Williamson, Larry W. Dyke, Charlotte Armstrong, Carl J. Smith, and other artists who made their homes in the western United States and who usually took their subject matter from either the Old or the New West. As he showed her through the house, he was eager to hear her reaction to it, and she didn't make him wait long. "It's beautiful," she said. "Stunning. Who was your interior decorator?" "You're looking at him." "Really?" "When I was poor, I looked forward to the day when I'd have a lovely home full of beautiful things, all arranged by the very best interior decorator. Then, when I had the money, I didn't want some stranger furnishing it for me. I wanted to have all the fun myself. Nancy, my late wife, and I decorated our first home. The project became a vocation for her, and I spent nearly as much time on it as I did on my legal practice. The two of us haunted furniture stores from Vegas to Los Angeles to San Francisco, antique shops, galleries, everything from flea markets to the most expensive stores we could find. We had a damn good time. And when she died, I discovered I couldn't learn to cope with the loss if I stayed in a place that was so crowded with memories of her. For 5 or 6 months, I was an emotional wreck because every object in the house reminded me of Nancy. Finally I took a few mementos, a dozen pieces by which I'll always remember her, and I moved out, sold the house, bought this one, and started decorating all over again." "I didn't realize you'd lost your wife," Tina said. "I mean, I thought it must have been a divorce or something." "She passed away 3 years ago." "What happened?" "Cancer." "I'm so sorry, Elliot." "At least it was fast." "Pancreatic cancer, exceedingly virulent." "She was gone 2 months after they diagnosed it." "Were you married long?" 12 years. She put a hand on his arm. 12 years leaves a big hole in the heart. He realized they had even more in common than he had thought. "That's right. You had Danny for nearly 12 years. With me, of course, it's only been little more than a year since I've been alone. With you, it's been 3 years. Maybe you can tell me." "What? Does it ever stop?" she asked. "The hurting?" "Yes. So far it hasn't. Maybe it will after 4 years. or 5, or 10. It doesn't hurt as bad now as it once did. And the ache isn't constant anymore. But still there are moments when. He showed her through the rest of the house, which she wanted to see. Her ability to create a stylish stage show was not a fluke. She had taste and a sharp eye that instantly knew the difference between prettiness and genuine beauty, between cleverness and art. He enjoyed discussing antiques and paintings with her, and an hour passed in what seemed to be only 10 minutes. The tour ended in the enormous kitchen, which boasted a copper ceiling, a Santa Fe tile floor, and restaurant-quality equipment. She checked the walk-in cooler, inspected the yard-square grill, the griddle, the 2 wolf ranges, the microwave, and the array of labor-saving appliances. You've spent a small fortune here. I guess your law practice isn't just another Vegas divorce mill. Elliot grinned. I'm one of the founding partners of Stryker, West, Dwyer, Coffey, and Nichols. We're one of the largest law firms in town. I can't take a whole lot of credit for that. We were lucky. We were in the right place at the right time. Owen West and I opened for business in a cheap storefront office 12 years ago, right at the start of the biggest boom this town has ever seen. We represented some people no one else would touch, entrepreneurs who had a lot of good ideas but not much money for startup legal fees. Some of our clients made smart moves and were carried right to the top by the explosive growth of the gaming industry and the Vegas real estate market, and we just sort of shot up there along with them, hanging on to their coattails. Interesting, Tina said. It is? You are. I am? You're so modest about having built a splendid law practice, yet you're an egomaniac when it comes to your cooking. He laughed. That's because I'm a better cook than attorney. Listen, why don't you mix us a couple of drinks while I change out of this suit? I'll be back in 5 minutes, and then you'll see how a true culinary genius operates. If it doesn't work out, we can always jump in the car and go to McDonald's for a hamburger. Philistine. Their hamburgers are hard to beat. I'll make you eat crow. How do you cook it? Very funny. Well, if you cook it very funny, I don't know if I want to eat it. If I did cook crow, he said, it would be delicious. You would eat every scrap of it, lick your fingers, and beg for more. Her smile was so lovely that he could have stood there all evening, just staring at the sweet curve of her lips. Elliot was amused by the effect that Tina had on him. He could not remember ever having been half so clumsy in the kitchen as he was this evening. He dropped spoons. He knocked over cans and bottles of spices. He forgot to watch a pot, and it boiled over. He made a mistake blending the salad dressing and had to begin again from scratch. She flustered him, and he loved it. "Elliot, are you sure you aren't feeling those cognacs we had at my office?" "Absolutely not." "Then the drink you've been sipping on here." "Number?" "This is just my kitchen style." "Spilling things is your style?" "It gives the kitchen a pleasant used look." "Are you sure you don't want to go to McDonald's?" "Do they bother to give their kitchen a pleasant used look?" "They not only have good hamburgers, their hamburgers have a pleasant used look. Their French fries are terrific." "So I spill things," he said. "A cook doesn't have to be graceful to be a good cook." "Does he have to have a good memory?" "Huh?" "That mustard powder you're just about to put into the salad dressing. What about it?" "You already put it in a minute ago." "I did?" "Thanks. I wouldn't want to have to mix this damn stuff 3 times. She had a throaty laugh that was not unlike Nancy's had been. Although she was different from Nancy in many ways, being with her was like being with Nancy. She was easy to talk to, bright, funny, sensitive. Perhaps it was too soon to tell for sure, but he was beginning to think that fate, in an uncharacteristic flush of generosity, had given him a second chance at happiness. When he and Tina finished dessert, Elliot poured second cups of coffee. "Still want to go to McDonald's for a hamburger?" The mushroom salad, the fettuccine alfredo, and the zabaglione had been excellent. "You really can cook." "Would I lie to you?" "I guess I'll have to eat that crow now." "I believe you just did. And I didn't even notice the feathers." While Tina and Elliot had been joking in the kitchen, even before dinner had been completely prepared, she had begun to think they might go to bed together. By the time they finished eating dinner, she knew they would. Elliot wasn't pushing her. For that matter, she wasn't pushing him, either. They were both being driven by natural forces. Like the rush of water downstream. Like the relentless building of a storm wind and then the lightning. They both realized that they were in need of each other, physically and mentally and emotionally, and that whatever happened between them would be good. It was fast but right, inevitable. At the start of the evening, the undercurrent of sexual tension made her nervous. She hadn't been to bed with any man but Michael in the past 14 years, since she was 19. She hadn't been to bed with anyone at all for almost 2 years. Suddenly it seemed to her that she had done a mad, stupid thing when she'd hidden away like a nun for 2 years. Of course, during the first of those 2 years, She'd still been married to Michael and had felt compelled to remain faithful to him, even though a separation and then a divorce had been in the works, and even though he had not felt constrained by any similar moral sense. Later, with a stage show to produce and with poor Danny's death weighing heavily on her, she hadn't been in the mood for romance. Now she felt like an inexperienced girl. She wondered if she would know what to do. She was afraid that she would be inept, clumsy, ridiculous, foolish in bed. She told herself that sex was just like riding a bicycle, impossible to unlearn, but the frivolousness of that analogy didn't increase her self-confidence. Gradually, however, as she and Elliot went through the standard rites of courtship, the indirect sexual thrusts and parries of a budding relationship, albeit at an accelerated pace, the familiarity of the games reassured her. Amazing that it should be so familiar. Maybe it really was a bit like riding a bicycle. After dinner, they adjourned to the den, where Elliot built a fire in the black granite fireplace. Although winter days in the desert were often as warm as springtime elsewhere, winter nights were always cool, sometimes downright bitter. With a chilly night wind moaning at the windows and howling incessantly under the eaves, the blazing fire was welcome. Tina kicked off her shoes. They sat side by side on the sofa in front of the fireplace, watching the flames and the occasional bursts of orange sparks, listening to music, and talking. Tina felt as if they had talked without pause all evening, speaking with quiet urgency, as if each had a vast quantity of earth-shakingly important information that he must pass on to the other before they parted. The more they talked, the more they found in common. As an hour passed in front of the fire, and then another hour, Tina discovered that she liked Elliot Stryker more with each new thing she learned about him. She never was sure who initiated the first kiss. He may have leaned toward her, or perhaps she tilted toward him. But before she realized what was happening, their lips met softly, briefly. Then again. And a third time. And then he began planting small kisses on her forehead, on her eyes, on her cheeks, her nose, the corners of her mouth, her chin. He kissed her ears, her eyes again, and left a chain of kisses along her neck, and when at last he returned to her mouth, he kissed her more deeply than before. And she responded at once, opening her mouth to him. His hands moved over her, testing the firmness and resilience of her, and she touched him too, gently squeezing his shoulders, his arms, the hard muscles of his back. Nothing had ever felt better to her than he felt at that moment. As if drifting in a dream, they left the den and went into the bedroom. He switched on a small lamp that stood upon the dresser, and he turned down the sheets. During the minute that he was away from her, she was afraid the spell was broken. But when he returned, she kissed him tentatively, found that nothing had changed, and pressed against him once more. She felt as if the two of them had been here, like this, locked in an embrace, many times before. "We hardly know each other," she said. "Is that the way you feel?" "No. Me, neither. I know you so well. For ages. Yet it's only been 2 days." "Too fast?" he asked. "What do you think?" "Not too fast for me." "Not too fast at all," she agreed. "Sure?" "Positive." "You're lovely." "Love me." He was not a particularly large man, but he picked her up in his arms as if she were a child. She clung to him. She saw a longing and a need in his dark eyes, a powerful wanting that was only partly sex, and she knew the same need to be loved and valued must be in her eyes for him to see. He carried her to the bed, put her down, and urged her to lie back. Without haste, with a breathless anticipation that lit up his face, he undressed her. He quickly stripped off his own clothes and joined her on the bed, took her in his arms. He explored her body slowly, deliberately, first with his eyes, then with his loving hands, then with his lips and tongue. Tina realized that she had been wrong to think that celibacy should be a part of her period of mourning. Just the opposite was true. Good, healthy lovemaking with a man who cared for her would have helped her recover much faster than she had done, for sex was the antithesis of death, a joyous celebration of life, a denial of the tomb's existence. The amber light molded to his muscles. He lowered his face to hers. They kissed. She slid a hand between them, squeezed and stroked him. She felt wanton, shameless, insatiable. As he entered her, she let her hands travel over his body, along his lean flanks. "You're so sweet," he said. He began the age-old rhythm of love. For a long, long time, they forgot that death existed, and they explored the delicious, silken surfaces of love, and it seemed to them, in those shining hours, that they would both live forever. Chapter 15. Tina stayed the night with Elliot, and he realized that he had forgotten how pleasant it could be to share his bed with someone for whom he truly cared. He'd had other women in this bed during the past 2 years, and a few had stayed the night, but not one of those other lovers had made him feel content merely by the fact of her presence, as Tina did. With her, sex was a delightful bonus, a lanyard, but it wasn't the main reason he wanted her beside him. She was an excellent lover, silken, smooth, and uninhibited in the pursuit of her own pleasure, but she was also vulnerable and kind. The vague, shadowy shape of her under the covers, in the darkness, was a talisman to ward off loneliness. Eventually he fell asleep, but at 4 o'clock in the morning, he was awakened by cries of distress. She sat straight up, the sheets knotted in her fists, catapulted out of a nightmare. She was quaking, gasping about a man dressed all in black, the monstrous figure from her dream. Elliot switched on the bedside lamp to prove to her that they were alone in the room. She had told him about the dreams, but he hadn't realized, until now, how terrible they were. The exhumation of Danny's body would be good for her, regardless of the horror that she might have to confront when the coffin lid was raised. If seeing the remains would put an end to these blood-curdling nightmares, she would gain an advantage from the grim experience. He switched off the bedside lamp and persuaded her to lie down again. He held her until she stopped shuddering. To his surprise, her fear rapidly changed to desire. They fell easily into the pace and rhythm that had earlier best pleased them. Afterward, they slipped into sleep again. Over breakfast, he asked her to go with him to the afternoon party at which he was going to corner Judge Kenbeck to ask about the exhumation. But Tina wanted to go back to her place and clean out Danny's room. She felt up to the challenge now, and she intended to finish the task before she lost her nerve again. "We'll see each other tonight, won't we?" he asked. "Yes. I'll cook for you again." She smiled lasciviously. "In what sense do you mean that?" She rose out of her chair, leaned across the table, kissed him. The smell of her, the vibrant blue of her eyes, the feel of her supple skin as he put a hand to her face, those things generated waves of affection and longing within him. He walked her to her Honda in the driveway and leaned in the window after she was behind the wheel, delaying her for another 15 minutes while he planned, to her satisfaction, every dish of this evening's dinner. When at last she drove away, he watched her car until it turned the corner and disappeared, and when she was gone, he knew why he had not wanted to let her go. He'd been trying to postpone her departure because he was afraid that he would never see her again after she drove off. He had no rational reason to entertain such dark thoughts. Certainly, the unknown person who was harassing Tina might have violent intentions. But Tina herself didn't think there was any serious danger, and Elliot tended to agree with her. The malicious tormentor wanted her to suffer mental anguish and spiritual pain, but he didn't want her to die, because that would spoil his fun. The fear Elliot felt at her departure was purely superstitious. He was convinced that, with her arrival on the scene, he had been granted too much happiness, too fast, too soon, too easily. He had an awful suspicion that fate was setting him up for another hard fall. He was afraid Tina Evans would be taken away from him just as Nancy had been. Unsuccessfully trying to shrug off the grim premonition, he went into the house. He spent an hour and a half in his library, paging through legal case books, boning up on precedents for the exhumation of a body that, as the court had put it, was to be disinterred in the absence of a pressing legal need, solely for humane reasons, in consideration of certain survivors of the deceased. Elliot didn't think Harold Kenbeck would give him any trouble, and he didn't expect the judge to request a list of precedents for something as relatively simple and harmless as reopening Danny's grave, but he intended to be well prepared. In Army intelligence, Kenbeck had been a fair but always demanding superior officer. At 1 o'clock Elliot drove his silver Mercedes S600 Sports Coupe to the New Year's Day party on Sunrise Mountain. The sky was cerulean blue and clear, and he wished he had time to take the Cessna up for a few hours. This was perfect weather for flying, one of those crystalline days when being above the earth would make him feel clean and free. On Sunday, when the exhumation was out of the way, maybe he would fly Tina to Arizona or to Los Angeles for the day. On Sunrise Mountain most of the big, expensive houses featured natural landscaping, which meant rocks, colored stones, and artfully arranged cacti instead of grass, shrubs, and trees, in acknowledgement that man's grip on this portion of the desert was new and perhaps tenuous. At night, the view of Las Vegas from the mountainside was undeniably spectacular, but Elliot couldn't understand what other reasons anyone could possibly have for choosing to live here rather than in the city's older, greener neighborhoods. On hot summer days, these barren, sandy slopes seemed God-forsaken, and they would not be made lush and green for another 10 years at least. On the brown hills, the huge houses thrust like the bleak monuments of an ancient, dead religion. The residents of Sunrise Mountain could expect to share their patios and decks and pool aprons with occasional visiting scorpions, tarantulas, and rattlesnakes. On windy days, the dust was as thick as fog, and it pushed its dirty little cat feet under doors, around windows, and through attic vents. The party was at a large Tuscan-style house, halfway up the slopes. A three-sided, fan-shaped tent had been erected on the back lawn, to one side of the 60-foot pool, with the open side facing the house. An 18-piece orchestra performed at the rear of the gaily striped canvas structure. Approximately 200 guests danced or milled about behind the house, and another 100 partied within its 20 rooms. Many of the faces were familiar to Elliot. Half of the guests were attorneys and their wives. Although a judicial purist might have disapproved, prosecutors and public defenders and tax attorneys and criminal lawyers and corporate counsel were mingling and getting pleasantly drunk with the judges before whom they argued cases most every week. Las Vegas had a judicial style and standards of its own. After 20 minutes of diligent mixing, Elliot found Harold Kenbeck. The judge was a tall, dour-looking man with curly white hair. He greeted Elliot warmly, and they talked about their mutual interests, cooking, flying, and river rafting. Elliot didn't want to ask Ken back for a favor within hearing of a dozen lawyers, and today there was nowhere in the house where they could be assured of privacy. They went outside and strolled down the street, past the party-goers' cars, which ran the gamut from Rolls-Royces to Range Rovers. Kenbeck listened with interest to Elliot's unofficial feeler about the chances of getting Danny's grave reopened. Elliot didn't tell the judge about the malicious prankster, for that seemed like an unnecessary complication. He still believed that once the fact of Danny's death was established by the exhumation, the quickest and surest way of dealing with the harassment was to hire a first-rate firm of private investigators to track down the perpetrator. Now, for the judge's benefit, and to explain why an exhumation had suddenly become such a vital matter, Elliot exaggerated the anguish and confusion that Tina had undergone as a direct consequence of never having seen the body of her child. Harry Kenbeck had a poker face that also looked like a poker, hard and plain, dark, and it was difficult to tell if he had any sympathy whatsoever for Tina's plight. As he and Elliot ambled along the sun-splashed street, Kenbeck mulled over the problem in silence for almost a minute. At last, he said, "What about the father?" "I was hoping you wouldn't ask." "Ah," Kenbeck said. "The father will protest." "You're positive?" "Yes." "On religious grounds?" Number. There was a bitter divorce shortly before the boy died. Michael Evans hates his ex-wife. Ah. So he'd contest the exhumation for no other reason but to cause her grief? That's right, Elliot said. No other reason. No legitimate reason. Still, I've got to consider the father's wishes. As long as there aren't any religious objections, the law requires the permission of only one parent in a case like this, Elliot said. Nevertheless, I have a duty to protect everyone's interests in the matter. If the father has a chance to protest, Elliot said, we'll probably get involved in a knockdown drag-out legal battle. It'll tie up a hell of a lot of the court's time. I wouldn't like that, Kenbeck said thoughtfully. The court's calendar is overloaded now. We simply don't have enough judges or enough money. The system's creaking and groaning. And when the dust finally settled, Elliot said, my client would win the right to exhume the body anyway. Probably. Definitely, Elliot said. Her husband would be engaged in nothing more than spiteful obstructionism. In the process of trying to hurt his ex-wife, he'd waste several days of the court's time, and the end result would be exactly the same as if he'd never been given a chance to protest. Ah, Kenbeck said, frowning slightly. They stopped at the end of the next block. Kenbeck stood with his eyes closed and his face turned up to the warm winter sun. At last, the judge said, "You're asking me to cut corners." "Not really. Simply issue an exhumation order on the mother's request. The law allows it." "You want the order right away, I assume?" "Tomorrow morning if possible." "And you'll have the grave reopened by tomorrow afternoon?" "Saturday at the latest." "Before the father can get a restraining order from another judge," Kenbeck said. "If there's no hitch, maybe the father won't ever find out about the exhumation." "Ah. Everyone benefits. The court saves a lot of time and effort. My client is spared a great deal of unnecessary anguish. And her husband saves a bundle in attorney's fees that he'd just be throwing away in a hopeless attempt to stop us." "Ah," Kenbeck said. In silence, they walked back to the house, where the party was getting louder by the minute. In the middle of the block, Kenbeck finally said, "I'll have to chew on it for a while, Elliot." "How long?" "Ah. Will you be here all afternoon?" "I doubt it. With all these attorneys, it's sort of a busman's holiday, don't you think?" "Going home from here?" Kenbeck asked. "Yes." "Ah." He pushed a curly strand of white hair back from his forehead. "Then I'll call you at home this evening. Can you at least tell me how you're leaning?" "In your favor, I suppose." "You know I'm right, Harry." Kenbeck smiled. "I've heard your argument, counselor. Let's leave it at that for now. I'll call you this evening, after I've had a chance to think about it." At least Kenbeck hadn't refused the request, nevertheless, Elliot had expected a quicker and more satisfying response. He wasn't asking the judge for much of a favor. Besides, the two of them went back a long way indeed. He knew that Kenbeck was a cautious man, but usually not excessively so. The judge's hesitation in this relatively simple matter struck Elliot as odd, but he said nothing more. He had no choice but to wait for Kenbeck's call. As they approached the house, they talked about the delights of pasta served with a thin, light sauce of olive oil, garlic, and sweet basil. Elliot remained at the party only 2 hours. There were too many attorneys and not enough civilians to make the bash interesting. Everywhere he went, he heard talk about torts, writs, briefs, suits, countersuits, motions for continuation, appeals, plea bargaining, and the latest tax shelters. The conversations were like those in which he was involved at work, 8 or 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, and he didn't intend to spend a holiday nattering about the same damn things. By 4 o'clock, he was home again, working in the kitchen. Tina was supposed to arrive at 6. He had a few chores to finish before she came, so they wouldn't have to spend a lot of time doing galley labor as they had done last night. Standing at the sink, he peeled and chopped a small onion, cleaned 6 stalks of celery, and peeled several slender carrots. He had just opened a bottle of balsamic vinegar and poured 4 ounces into a measuring cup when he heard movement behind him. Turning, he saw a strange man enter the kitchen from the dining room. The guy was about 5 feet 8 with a narrow face and a neatly trimmed blonde beard. He wore a dark blue suit, white shirt, and blue tie, and he carried a physician's bag. He was nervous. "What the hell?" Elliot said. A second man appeared behind the first. He was considerably more formidable than his associate, tall, rough-edged, with large, big-knuckled, leathery hands, like something that had escaped from a recombinant DNA lab experimenting in the crossbreeding of human beings with bears. In freshly pressed slacks, a crisp blue shirt, a patterned tie, and a gray sports jacket, he might have been a professional hitman uncomfortably gotten up for the baptism of his mafia don's grandchild. But he didn't appear to be nervous at all. "What is this?" Elliot demanded. Both intruders stopped near the refrigerator, 12 or 14 feet from Elliot. The small man fidgeted, and the tall man smiled. "How'd you get in here?" "A lock-release gun," the tall man said, smiling cordially and nodding. "Bob here," he indicated the smaller man, "has the neatest set of tools. Makes things easier." "What the hell is this about?" "Relax," said the tall man. "I don't keep a lot of money here." No, the tall man said. "It's not money." Bob shook his head in agreement, frowning, as if he was dismayed to think that he could be mistaken for a common thief. "Just relax," the tall man repeated. "You've got the wrong guy," Elliot assured them. "You're the one, all right." "Yes," Bob said. "You're the one. There's no mistake." The conversation had the disorienting quality of the off-kilter exchanges between Alice and the scrawny denizens of Wonderland. Putting down the vinegar bottle and picking up the knife, Elliot said, "Get the fuck out of here." "Calm down, Mr. Stryker," the tall one said. "Yes," Bob said. "Please calm down." Elliot took a step toward them. The tall man pulled a silencer-equipped pistol out of a shoulder holster that was concealed under his gray sports jacket. "Easy. Just you take it real nice and easy." Elliot backed up against the sink. "That's better," the tall man said. "Much better," Bob said. "Put the knife down, and we'll all be happy." "Let's keep this happy," Bob agreed. Yeah, nice and happy. The Mad Hatter would be along any minute now. Down with the knife, said the tall man. Come on, come on. Finally, Elliot put it down. Push it across the counter, out of reach. Elliot did as he was told. Who are you guys? As long as you cooperate, you won't get hurt, the tall man assured him. Bob said, let's get on with it, Vince. Vince, the tall man, said, we'll use the breakfast area over there in the corner. Bob went to the round maple table. He put down the black physician's bag, opened it, and withdrew a compact cassette tape recorder. He removed other things from the bag too, a length of flexible rubber tubing, a sphygmomanometer for monitoring blood pressure, 2 small bottles of amber-colored fluid, and a packet of disposable hypodermic syringes. Elliot's mind raced through a list of cases that his law firm was currently handling, searching for some connection with these 2 intruders, but he couldn't think of one. The tall man gestured with a gun. Go over to the table and sit down. Not until you tell me what this is all about. I'm giving the orders here. But I'm not taking them. I'll put a hole in you if you don't move. Number. You won't do that, Elliot said, wishing that he felt as confident as he sounded. You've got something else in mind, and shooting me would ruin it. Move your ass over to that table. Not until you explain yourself. Vince glared at him. Elliot met the stranger's eyes and didn't look away. At last, Vince said, be reasonable. We've just got to ask you some questions. Determined not to let them see that he was frightened, aware that any sign of fear would be taken as proof of weakness, Elliot said, well, you've got one hell of a weird approach for someone who's just taking a public opinion survey. Move. What are the hypodermic needles for? Move. What are they for? Vince sighed. We gotta be sure you tell us the truth. The entire truth, said Bob. Drugs? Elliot asked. They're effective and reliable, said Bob. And when you've finished, I'll have a brain the consistency of grape jelly. No, no, Bob said. These drugs won't do any lasting physical or mental damage. What sort of questions? Elliot asked. I'm losing my patience with you, Vince said. It's mutual, Elliot assured him. Move. Elliot didn't move an inch. He refused to look at the muzzle of the pistol. He wanted them to think that guns didn't scare him. Inside, he was vibrating like a tuning fork. You son of a bitch, move. What sort of questions do you want to ask me? The big man scowled. Bob said, "For Christ's sake, Vince, tell him. He's going to hear the questions anyway when he finally sits down. Let's get this over with and split." Vince scratched his concrete block shin with a shovel of a hand and then reached inside his jacket. From an inner pocket, he withdrew a few sheets of folded typing paper. The gun wavered, but it didn't move off target far enough to give Elliot a chance. "I'm supposed to ask you every question on this list," Vince said, shaking the folded paper at Elliot. "It's a lot, 30 or 40 questions altogether, but it won't take long if you just sit down over there and cooperate." "Questions about what?" Elliot insisted. "Christina Evans." This was the last thing Elliot expected. He was dumbfounded. "Tina Evans? What about her?" "Got to know why she wants her little boy's grave reopened." Elliot stared at him, amazed. "How do you know about that?" "Never mind," Vince said. "Yeah," Bob said. "Never mind how we know. The important thing is we do know. Are you the bastards who've been harassing Tina?" "Huh? Are you the ones who keep sending her messages?" "What messages?" Bob asked. "Are you the ones who wrecked the boys' room?" "What are you talking about?" Vince asked. "We haven't heard anything about this." "Someone's sending messages about the kid?" Bob asked. They appeared to be genuinely surprised by this news, and Elliot was pretty sure they weren't the people who had been trying to scare Tina. Besides, though they both struck him as slightly wacky, they didn't seem to be merely hoaxers or borderline psychopaths who got their kicks by scaring defenseless women. They looked and acted like organization men, even though the big one was rough enough at the edges to pass for a common thug. A silencer-equipped pistol, lock-release gun, truth serums, their apparatus indicated that these guys were part of a sophisticated outfit with substantial resources. "What about the messages she's been getting?" Vince asked, still watching Elliot closely. "I guess that's just one more question you're not going to get an answer for," Elliot said. "We'll get the answer," Vince said coldly. "We'll get all the answers," Bob agreed. "Now," Vince said, "Counselor, are you going to walk over to the table and sit your ass down, or am I going to have to motivate you with this?" He gestured with his pistol again. "Kenbeck," Elliot said, startled by a sudden insight. "The only way you could have found out about the exhumation so quickly is if Kenbeck told you." The two men glanced at each other. They were unhappy to hear the judge's name. "Who?" Vince asked, but it was too late to cover the revealing look they had exchanged. That's why he stalled me, Elliot said. He wanted to give you time to get to me. Why in the hell should Kenbeck care whether or not Danny's grave is reopened? Why should you care? Who the hell are you people? The Ursine escapee from the island of Dr. Moreau was no longer merely impatient, he was angry. Listen, you stupid fuck, I'm not gonna humor you any longer. I'm not gonna answer any more questions, but I am gonna put a bullet in your crotch if you don't move over to the table and sit down. Elliot pretended not to have heard the threat. The pistol still frightened him, but he was now thinking of something else that scared him more than the gun. A chill spread from the base of his spine, up his back, as he realized what the presence of these men implied about the accident that had killed Danny. There's something about Danny's death. Something strange about the way all those scouts died. The truth of it isn't anything like the version everyone's been told. The bus accident. That's a lie, isn't it? Neither man answered him. The truth is a lot worse, Elliot said. Something so terrible that some powerful people want to hush it up. Kenbeck. Once an agent, always an agent. Which set of letters do you guys work for? Not the FBI. They're all Ivy Leaguers these days, polished, educated. Same for the CIA. You're too crude. Not the SID, for sure, there's no military discipline about you. Let me guess. You work for some set of letters the public hasn't even heard about yet. Something secret and dirty. Vince's face darkened like a slab of spam on a hot griddle. God damn it, I said you were going to answer the questions from now on. Relax, Elliot said. I've played your game. I was in Army intelligence back when. I'm not exactly an outsider. I know how it works, the rules, the moves. You don't have to be so hard-assed with me. Open up. Give me a break, and I'll give you a break. Evidently sensing Vince's onrushing blow-up and aware that it wouldn't help them accomplish their mission, Bob quickly said, Listen, Stryker, we can't answer most of your questions because we don't know. Yes, we work for a government agency. Yes, it's one you've never heard of and probably never will. But we don't know why this Danny Evans kid is so important. We haven't been told the details, not even half of them. And we don't want to know all of it, either. You understand what I'm saying, the less a guy knows, the less he can be nailed for later. Christ, we're not big shots in this outfit. We're strictly hired help. They only tell us as much as we need to know. So will you cool it? Just come over here, sit down, let me inject you, give us a few answers, and we can all get on with our lives. We can't just stand here forever. If you're working for a government intelligence agency, then go away and come back with the legal papers, Elliot said. Show me search warrants and subpoenas. You know better than that, Vince said harshly. The agency we work for doesn't officially exist, Bob said. So how can an agency that doesn't exist go to court for a subpoena? Get serious, Mr. Stryker. If I do submit to the drug, what happens to me after you've got your answers? Elliot asked. Nothing, Vince said. Nothing at all, Bob said. How can I be sure? At this indication of imminent surrender, the tall man relaxed slightly, although his lumpish face was still flushed with anger. I told you. When we've got what we want, we'll leave. We just have to find out exactly why the Evans woman wants the grave reopened. We have to know if someone's ratted to her. If someone has, then we gotta spike his ass to a barn door. But we don't have anything against you. Not personally, you know. After we find out what we want to know, we'll leave. And let me go to the police? Elliot asked. Cops don't scare us, Vince said arrogantly. Hell, you won't be able to tell them who we are or where they can start looking for us. They won't get anywhere. Nowhere. Zip. And if they do pick up our trail somehow, we can put pressure on them to drop it fast. This is national security business, pal, the biggest of the big time. The government is allowed to bend the rules if it wants. After all, it makes them. That's not quite the way they explained the system in law school, Elliot said. Yeah, well, that's ivory tower stuff, Bob said, nervously straightening his tie. Right, Vince said. And this is real life. Now sit down at the table like a good boy. Please, Mr. Stryker, Bob said. No. When they got their answers, they would kill him. If they had intended to let him live, they wouldn't have used the real names in front of him. And they wouldn't have wasted so much time coaxing him to cooperate, they would have used force without hesitation. They wanted to gain his cooperation without violence because they were reluctant to mark him. Their intention was that his death should appear to be an accident or a suicide. The scenario was obvious. Probably a suicide. While he was still under the influence of the drug, they might be able to make him write a suicide note and sign it in a legible, identifiable script. Then they would carry him out to the garage, prop him up in his little Mercedes, put the seat belt snugly around him, and start the engine without opening the garage door. He would be too drugged to move, and the carbon monoxide would do the rest. In a day or two, someone would find him out there, his face blue-green-gray, his tongue dark and lolling, his eyes bulging in their sockets as he stared through the windshield as if on the drive to hell. If there were no unusual marks on his body, no injuries incompatible with the coroner's determination of suicide, the police would be quickly satisfied. "No," he said again, louder this time. "If you bastards want me to sit down at that table, you're going to have to drag me there."